Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to ECHA's online information session to support our current call for evidence on a possible restriction of microplastics. We have about an hour and a half today to discuss the issue, and we hope this will be very informative and help you with responding to the call for evidence. The panel you can see before you today is three people from the Risk Management Implementation Unit here at ECHA. My name is Mark Blaney. I'm the Process Coordinator for Restrictions, and I have my two colleagues, Evgenia Stoyanova, who is one of our socio-economic analysts who's working on this issue, and Peter Simpson, who is the Scientific Officer and Project Manager working on this project. So to start off this online information session, we have a brief presentation, and then we will be open to your questions. So first, how do you ask a question? Well, in this case, you use the Q&A panel that's on the WebEx. You can see that on the screen before you. We will try and answer as many questions that you put to us as we can today, and if we don't manage to get to answer your question, you can either send the question in after the event to the email address you see on the screen, or you can wait and look at the questions and answers document that we intend to publish as soon as possible after this WebEx, to give everyone an opportunity to see what questions were asked and what our answers were. If you have a press inquiry, then you should send those to the press mailbox, press@echa.europa.eu. Again, you can see that on the screen. Oops, sorry. The recording will be published. You can find those on our YouTube channel. The address you can see on the screen as well. And we will have the material also linked on our website. So now to move on to the topic itself. What is the objective of this session today? Well, firstly, it's to introduce the REACH restriction procedure in a little bit, just to make sure that everyone's up to speed with how we deal with restrictions in ECHA. To outline the scope of our investigation into intentionally used microplastics in products, and most importantly, to help potential respondents decide if and what information you should submit in the call for evidence. We would also like to clarify certain elements of the information that we have requested, to make sure that it's understood exactly what we would like to get from this call for evidence. Two things that this webinar is not meant to be. Firstly, a debate about whether a restriction is needed or not. And also, it's not an information session about the oxo-degradable plastics restriction work. We will have a separate call for evidence for that starting in April. And today we are just focusing on the microplastics, intentionally used microplastics. So firstly, just to introduce restrictions under REACH. What is a restriction? Well, firstly, it can be any condition on the manufacture, import or use of a substance, also a substance in a mixture or a substance in an article, and it's a safety net if other risk management options in REACH are not appropriate. It should address a risk that is not adequately controlled, and it's when action is needed to be taken at the union level. So not national issues, but issues which need to be dealt with across the union. ECHA investigate the need for restriction based on the request of the Commission, and we have 12 months to develop a report based on our investigation to whether or not a restriction is needed. Information gathering or analysis might show as I said, whether or not action is needed under REACH, or if perhaps a different scope is needed from what's in the Commission's request. And in this case, it's normally a narrowing of the scope rather than a widening of the scope. To start the process, we make an entry in the Registry of Intentions, the ROI, and you can see on the middle line this was done for microplastics, and probably the most important date there is the date that's highlighted, which is the expected date of submission if we decide to propose a restriction. If we turn now to the considerations that we make when deciding on whether a restriction is needed, first of all, about risk. We do a risk assessment according to Annex 1 of REACH, and that risk assessment depends on the properties of the substance or substances that we are looking at. Firstly, if they're a threshold substance, we apply what's called the DNL-PNEC approach, which looks at a threshold level above which the substance causes its effect, and then we look at whether or not in the union those levels are reached in humans or in the environment. Or we can look at other types of substances which have PBT, persistent bioaccumulative or toxic properties, or very persistent, very bioaccumulative substances, or other substances which don't have a threshold, such as most carcinogens. And there we have a different type of approach. We look more qualitative or semi-quantitative approach. And then there's a third type of way we can address risk considerations, where the above two approaches are not practical. Then we can look at risks on a case-by-case basis. Related to the impact, we look at the effectiveness of the proposed measure, and the key criteria that we look for in justifying a restriction related to its effectiveness is whether it's targeted to the exposure or the risks, that the restriction would be capable of reducing those risks, and that whatever measure is proposed is proportionate to the risk. And by proportionate, we mean looking at the costs versus the benefits of the proposed measure. A little bit more about that issue. In relation to the costs, we look at a number of issues, economic costs, and this quite often is the cost of moving from the substance under consideration to its alternatives. But we also look at other negative aspects on the supply chain. We look at social impacts and wider economic impacts. In relation to benefits, we can look at both benefits to human health and the environment. And then once we have finished our investigation, we decide whether or not to make the restriction, and we submit the dossier, which kicks off the next part of the process. And we submit this dossier in what we call the Annex 15 format, and this is a prescribed format, looking at what's the problem, what's the impact assessment, the uncertainties, and the conclusion. We then make this report publicly available on our website so that everyone can see the decision that we've come to and the considerations that we've made. And then the second part of the process begins, and this is the opinion making in ECHA's committees. And here we start with a conformity check. Does the report meet all of the necessary requirements? And then both committees start evaluating the dossier. We won't go into that further today, but just to inform you of the various stages that the dossier goes through. So now to do a little bit more on the scope of our investigation into intentional uses. So why are we looking at microplastics? Well, I'm sure most of you know there have been many recent scientific studies suggesting that microplastic particles pose a threat to the aquatic environment. A number of member states have already taken measures to ban the use of microplastics in some products, for example microbeads in certain consumer and other uses. And the Commission have requested us to develop an Annex 15 dossier because of this concern, and we will submit this, as I said earlier, in January, on the 11th of January. I mentioned that member states and other areas have already made restrictions on microplastics, and this is a brief list of those that we know about and are taken into consideration, both within the EU, France, Italy, UK and Sweden, and then also outside the EU there are restrictions either in force or coming in the US, Canada and New Zealand. What's the scope of our investigation? Well, we're at the moment looking at a very wide scope. We're investigating a restriction on the intentional uses of microplastics. We look at microplastics that either have been intentionally added as ingredients to a product, or we're looking at products that are designed to intentionally release microplastic particles during their life cycle. There is also other work going on microplastics, and this restriction has a complementary scope to those. For example, the Commission are studying microplastics created during the life cycle of a product through wear and tear, or those that are emitted through accidental spills. And if you're interested in this issue, you can see the web address on the screen, which gives more information. As I said, the initial scope of our investigation is deliberately wide. We are looking at a very wide scope of intentional use to make sure we understand what's going on in the industry. So we're looking at the intentional use in products of any kind across all sectors. We want to understand the diversity of uses across these sectors, and the scope of any proposed restriction will be based on this information and our analysis of risks and the socio-economic impacts resulting from that analysis. We already know of a number of intentional uses, and you can see that on the screen. The Commission had a project to look into this issue before they asked us to start our investigation, and we have identified uses in cosmetics, in paints and coatings, detergents, as industrial abrasives, in oil and gas, and uses in agriculture. And we're interested in both uses that we already know about to supplement the information we already have, but also in uses that we have not yet identified to make sure that we can take them into account in our investigation. To help with the ongoing work, the call for evidence, we have a working definition of microplastic, that it's any polymer containing solid or semi-solid particle having a size of 5 millimeters or less in at least one external dimension. And we give some more information about this definition in the background document of the call for evidence, such as potential definitions of solid and semi-solid. So you should read the background document thoroughly before you make your submission to the call, to make sure that you understand our working definition. So this definition applies assessment, but as I said, not necessarily a restriction, on all relevant sectors, not limited to cosmetics or personal care, as a number of existing restrictions have been, to all potential functions of microplastic particles, not limited to exfoliating or cleansing function, intentional uses of biodegradable or bio-based microplastics particles, intentional use of nanoplastic particles, intentional use of non-carbon based polymers, for example polysiloxanes, and intentional uses of hydrogel polymers in particles. The key challenges that we have already identified leading to our information needs: the scope. First of all, we know we need to have an appropriate definition of microplastic particles, and we have, as I've already said, given a tentative definition within this call for evidence. We also need to identify and understand the uses and sectors affected. We need to undertake the risk assessment. So the releases, we need to know about the releases of microparticles from both types of uses, intentional uses that we are looking at. So the intentionally added and the intentionally released. And also we need to look at the nature of the hazard and the risk. We will also look at or carry out an analysis of the alternatives. So what is the function, and to do that we need to know the function of the microplastic particles in the products that are currently in use, and also the technical and economic feasibility of alternatives. We will also carry out socio-economic analysis. So the information we need for this is both the costs for the affected industry and society, and the benefits. In this case, what would be the environmental benefits of any potential restriction. The timeline for our work. At the moment we are in the first phase that you can see on the screen, the project scoping and planning and the call for evidence. We're also carrying out a literature review during this time. Then in the second quarter of the year we will look to make our internal problem identification document. So this sets out in more detail the issues that we need to look at and starts to assess the information we have received relating to those issues. We intend to hold a stakeholder workshop at the end of May, and this will be to look into further details of the information that we have gathered and assessed to make sure that we fully understand the issues that are raised. This workshop will be by invitation only, and we will invite stakeholders based on their responses in the public in the call for evidence. We will assess the information that's been submitted, and we will invite relevant stakeholders who have made such responses. Then after that we will decide whether or not there needs to be further information gathering, either from the workshop, from the discussion at the workshop, or because we still need to look further into specific detail. Then during the third quarter of the year we will be writing the Annex 15 report and deciding whether or not a restriction is warranted. And then in the last quarter of the year we will finalise our report for submission in January 2019 if we decide a restriction is proposed. If we decide a restriction is not necessary, we will still finish the Annex 15 report but then submit it to the Commission for their consideration. The call for evidence that we're discussing today is open until the 11th of May, and we very much welcome your responses to this. I mentioned a background document to the call, and this is situated at the bottom of the web page where the call is advertised, and we very much encourage you to read this background document in detail before deciding what to respond in the call for evidence. Now a little bit of a deeper look into the specific evidence and information that we've requested. First of all, looking at the working definition. Our objective at the end of the day is to adopt an appropriate and an unambiguous definition. We have made a potential definition available to you, and we are interested very much in how that would affect your work. So we need to make sure that the definition is relevant to potential risks. We need to make sure that the definition, we are aware of other definitions that are already in the existing restrictions, and we are aware that the working definition may evolve to take into account information that's received in the call for evidence. For example, differing information on solubility, particle definitions, minimum and maximum dimensions, and this will be one area that will definitely evolve during the restriction making process. So we definitely invite you to share your views on the proposed working definition, how it is relevant to the risk, what impacts this definition might have to your industry, and what might be the unintended consequences of the definition. And then also how the definition could be improved. Questions 2 and 3 are on the manufacture, use and function of the microplastic particles. As we said earlier, we have some information on uses, but we know this isn't a comprehensive outlook. We also need to know more about which actors in the supply chain produce and sell microplastic particles. And we also, in the background document, list certain types of information, specific information we're interested in, such as the identity of polymers used in microplastic particles, the technical function, particle size, particle morphology, for example. This list isn't exhaustive, and it's set out in more detail in the background document. We're also looking for information on alternatives. Specific information that we're looking for includes what alternatives are already existing or emerging on the market, what existing market share of products use alternatives rather than microplastic particles. So we're looking for technical and economic information on alternatives, as you can see listed below, including product performance, price differences, reformulation costs, and timelines to transition from microplastics to the alternatives. These are all issues that we're interested in learning about in this call for evidence. And also, we need to know whether the availability of the alternatives is sufficient to serve the market, either now or in the future. And then lastly, we're looking for information on socio-economic impacts. So we need to know about relative costs and benefits of any potential restriction on the affected actors in the supply chain. And that's right from the beginning, from the manufacturers of microplastics, right to the end users. We need information on how the supply chain and society as a whole will react to a restriction, how they will transition to alternatives, or will in fact certain products be discontinued because of any potential restriction. The information we're looking for could include key economic parameters, such as the turnover for concerned sectors, the number of people employed, the current share of products containing microplastics. Related to the information on hazard and risk, this is one area where we know there's a lot of intensive research going on, and we will undertake our own review of the published literature. But in the call for evidence, you're very welcome to tell us why a particular study is very relevant to our work, and also to inform us of ongoing research that's relevant to this work that might report during this year or next year, that could be taken into account during the restriction process. Who should participate? Well, it's open to any interested stakeholders. It could be manufacturers, suppliers, distributors, importers. It could be trade associations. It could be scientific institutions and academics. It could be NGOs, and of course it could be members of the public. We would very much encourage you to share as much information as you can. We know the time frame is limited, but we would very much suggest that you share the information. If you're not sure about a particular piece of information, please share it rather than not, because we need to know all of the issues to take into consideration in our investigation. And then lastly, to say that if we need to consider any derogations from the restriction, if we decide to make one, then at our stage they can only be justified if adequate information and analysis is provided in this call. Of course, there are opportunities to make restrictions during later parts of the process, but then the onus will be very much on you who want to make the restriction to fully justify, both in terms of risk and socio-economic analysis, during the public consultation that occurs during the opinion-making part of the process. Now we can, of course, enter a dialogue to understand why a restriction may be necessary, and this can be more fruitful to discuss during the restriction dossier making rather than later on in the process. So now we move on to the question and answer session. I can see that we have a couple of questions already submitted, so we will get to those in a second. But please use the question and answer panel that I showed right at the beginning to send in your questions, and then myself and my colleagues will be happy to answer the questions to make sure that the call for evidence is as fruitful as possible. So let's go straight into the questions. First of all, Pete, maybe I could ask you this one. Mm-hmm. Is ECHA considering solid and semi-solid polymers added as a raw material or as present in a finished goods? And it gives an example here: a powder raw material that is melted into a liquid emulsion should be out of scope, but the background document does not clearly specify this. Can you perhaps show some light on this?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a good question. It's something that we've been thinking about on our side when we were putting the call for evidence together. Essentially what we want to try and understand is what are the sectors that use microplastics. And you might use a microplastic as a raw material, or you might use it as a raw material that will end up in a finished good, or you could use it as a raw material that would perhaps be consumed and not be present in a finished good. I think at this stage of our investigation, we wanted to cast our net rather wide and have an understanding of as many uses as possible. But that is, of course, very different from what uses that could be subject to a potential restriction. And I think the question here very much describes a situation where the microplastics are no longer present within a finished good, and they wouldn't be intentionally released from that good during its service life. We do want to understand these uses, we want to know how prevalent they are, but in terms of whether or not a risk like this would, a use like this, where the microplastics aren't present in the final good, whether or not they would pose an unacceptable risk on the EU-wide basis, I think would be maybe not consistent with what a risk from microplastics are. But please tell us about these uses and then allow us to refine the scope as we go in terms of our analysis.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Evgenia, there's another question here. If the use of a microplastic within a specific sector is tailor-made to each and every single operative or operation or project, getting consolidated figures is highly difficult, and I think they saw that during the AMIC report. So if we don't get data from all these uses, what would be our fallback approach in the investigation?
Well, it is very important that we get valuable information on uses and the alternatives for each of the uses. It is in the absence of such information, stakeholders risk that their use will be wrapped up into a broader definition and potentially a broader restriction, where we don't identify specifically the impacts on this niche application, and we don't tailor-made the restriction for their needs, such as if there is a lot of large releases to the environment and risk cannot be demonstrated, such uses could be exempted or derogated from the restriction. Or if there's no alternatives, or the transition to the alternatives will take a few years, then in this case longer transitional period may be proposed. So it is just, we need to highlight that it is very important that we receive information on different uses of microplastics, and this will help us already consider at the beginning of our work any potential derogations or appropriate transitional periods for all uses of microplastics.
Okay, thank you. Pete, another question here. We understand that only particles consisting completely of polymers are in scope. That would leave coated particles out of scope. Can you confirm or deny that understanding?
Yeah, it's a good question here. So actually I can confirm that isn't our intention. So our definition, our working definition, considers polymer containing particles. So that can be a particle that only contains a rather small amount of polymer, but that would still be consistent with our working definition. We know, of course, that plastics are comprised of polymers as well as other additives as well. So we need to make sure that we look at the not just polymers, purely polymers, but a polymer containing particle. So a coated particle is within the scope of our investigation and could be within the scope of a potential restriction. So I hope that clarifies that.
Okay, thanks, Pete. We have another question here: how we plan to identify and track microplastics. There is already an issue on tracking regular substances. How will you track the size? I think we've already a little bit gone over the identification of microplastics in terms of the definition. In terms of the uses, we are looking for all types of uses for the intentionally added microplastics. If you mean tracking by monitoring what happens now and after a potential restriction, this is again part of the work we will do during our investigation. We have to look at the current situation and also look at how we might monitor the potential restriction later. we will need to look at this in more detail. I think we haven't really thought about this in great detail at the moment. This is one thing we have to think about during the investigation, and if you have any information or suggestions how we might do that, I think it's very welcome during the call for evidence. And Pete, sorry, do you want to?
Well, I would just add that we, when we develop a restriction proposal, we look at the practicality and enforceability of the proposed measure, and of course, being able to track microplastic particles in products, to detect them, for example, and to distinguish between an intentionally added microplastic particle and perhaps an unintentional microplastic particle within a product will be important for us to consider as we do this, and what methods and ways could be proposed for us to during a potential restriction.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question on the use of microbeads in vitro diagnostics. Maybe I can just ask Evgenia. They are magnetic beads on which certain proteins, antibodies or antigens have been bound as markers. Are in vitro medical devices included in the scope of the restriction?
This sounds very much to me like scientific research and development, but because on the basis of this brief description we can determine, it would be useful if you provide us with the information, and then we will assess whether this use falls within the scope of REACH, or if it does, whether it falls within the scope of other legislation, and then in the process of developing the proposal. And if we are recommending a restriction, then we also will be assessing whether this particular use is better handled under REACH or another legislation, such as on medical devices, for example, if it falls under that. So we would welcome any information that you can provide to us, specifically describing the use, the function of the microplastics, if there's any alternatives, and maybe we can also point them to our guidance on scientific research and development. Maybe that will help you understand what kind of information we need in order to determine whether the use is within REACH or better handled under other legislation.
Yes, and we can do that. We will do that in the questions and answers. We will make a link to that particular guidance. I think it's a very good idea.
Yeah.
Did you want to add
Well,
something?
I would just say I think this interface between medicines and medical devices within REACH will be something important for us to clarify in this Q&A document that we prepare afterwards.
Okay, thanks both for that. Pete, maybe I can ask you this next question. Are naturally derived polymers in the scope of this work? And they give the example here of cellulose.
Yeah, sure. I think it should be quite clear, we hope, from the background document, in that we're looking at any polymer containing particle at this stage of the investigation, irrespective of where that polymer material is derived. So it could be a naturally derived polymer, but yes, we're still interested in this at the moment. I think it will very much depend on the risks posed by these types of polymer containing particles, whether or not the eventual scope of a restriction will also contain cellulose derived materials. So considerations in terms of biodegradability will be very important. So if there's information on the degradability of a cellulose derived polymer containing particle in different environmental compartments, this should be provided as much as possible, at least during the call for evidence.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And then I might come back straight to you.
Okay.
There's a question here: what solid data will you use to quantify environmental harm as opposed to media perceptions?
Absolutely, and again, this is something that Mark highlighted very early on, in that we will need to establish if there's an unacceptable risk on a union-wide basis from the use of microplastic particles. And under REACH, we have various ways of doing a risk assessment and considering different types of hazard properties. So we'll, of course, be engaging with the scientific community we'll be reviewing the scientific literature, and we will come to a conclusion about the type of risk that's posed by a microplastic particle. I think it's important to emphasise that under REACH, we're doing all of this within the context of a scientific risk assessment, and that risk assessment will be reviewed independently by the RAC in the event any restriction is proposed. So we are following very closely the scientific arguments in terms of the risks posed by microplastics, and not necessarily focusing just on sort of media perceptions of microplastics, although we realise that they are very important to within the public domain at the moment, this issue of plastics, and that's, of course, we've been asked by the Commission to look at this restriction as a consequence of their plastic strategy.
Thank you, Pete. We have a question here that I believe you said that the microplastics covered are the ones intentionally added or intentionally released. That's correct. You asked to confirm that. And then you supplement that, are microplastics not intentionally added which are released? And if not, why make the distinction? I think here that we want to make the distinction that we are including both microplastics which you would normally think of as intentionally added, such as the ones in cosmetics for certain functions, but also ones where it's intended to, as part of their function, that microplastics might be released, such as I think it's nutrient prills. Is that right, Pete? Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Again, I mean, I think the reason that we have this sort of two elements to the objective is to be complementary to the other ongoing work on microplastic particles that are produced during the life cycle of a product with these unintentional microplastics. The scope of their work explicitly excluded products that are intentionally designed to release microplastic particles. So we are therefore including them because they would be an intentional release of microplastic particles. We wanted to make that clear at this stage of the proposal, but whether or not there are products on the market that don't contain microplastic particles but then intentionally release microplastic particles, we're not 100% sure what those products are and in what sectors they are. So very much we are hoping that people will tell us if there are these uses at the moment where microplastics are being intentionally released but they're not present in the product themselves. It's very much in terms of the design of that product and the function of that product is implicit on these microplastics being released. They pose this function as they are released. So please tell us about them, and of course if there aren't products like this, then of course we wouldn't restrict them. I think that's clear.
Okay. We have another question here about the another regulation on plastics from the UAE regulation for plastics regarding in particular oxoplastics. Do we know about this, and is this in contrast with the EU Commission approach? Evgenia, have you come across this particular piece of legislation?
No, they may be referring to a national legislation on oxo-degradable plastics in the UAE. Perhaps this is something that we could handle during the call for evidence on oxo-degradable plastics. We said we're not going to discuss this a lot. The Commission has asked us to investigate microplastics and, as a second project, oxo-degradable plastics. And as Mark said, the work on oxo-degradable plastics will, the call for evidence will begin in April, and at that stage we'll be clarifying a bit more what kind of information.
Thank you. And I think it's also worth saying that if you know of national legislation related to microplastics, we'd be very interested in hearing about this if we haven't already identified it, and also what effect these national legislations have had on your uses, on your products. Again, we'd be very interested in your information on that. Okay, so then moving on to the next questions. Pete, would synthetic silica particles be included as non-carbon polymers?
I think this would come back to whether or not they would be consistent with the REACH definition of a polymer, which is of course our starting point. I wouldn't like to say definitively now whether or not we would consider a silica containing particle to be consistent with our definition or not. So I propose we come back to that one afterwards, Mark, in our Q&A document.
Okay, thanks. Then we have a question on the definition. Is the less than 5 millimeters a medium particle size? Pete, can you?
Well, the less than 5 millimeters and the less than 5 millimeters in any dimension was something that we incorporated because it's been used in existing national legislation, and also within this national legislation. At least I haven't seen that expressed as a particle size definition, so we haven't included it for now. But we know that other definitions of particles in REACH, including for nanomaterials, for example, make use of particle size definitions or looking at particle size distributions, and a certain percentage of particles would be inside or outside of a particular threshold. So I would say that any definition that we had for microplastics could include some element of particle size distribution, if that would make it more practical and meaningful. So again, in terms of feedback to us about the proposed working definition, please tell us about experience with particle size distributions and whether or not that would or would not help in terms of having an unambiguous definition of a microplastic particle.
Thank you. We have another question here on the definition. The definition is deliberately broad. For industry to provide relevant information, we would need more clarity on the definition as a first step. Has ECHA considered proceeding in 2 steps? First, agree on a definition, and then gather the use and other data. Evgenia, could you shed some light on that?
Well, it's the chicken or the egg question. I guess we do need a little bit more information on uses in order for us to be able to refine the definition on microplastics. At this stage, we are deliberately broad, and then on the basis of feedback we received during the call for evidence, we will refine this definition further. And it will relate, and also on the basis of investigation that my colleagues on the risk assessment side do, is that what constitutes a risk, whether that risk is impacted by the morphology of the substance, of the particle, whether it matters, whether really the 5 millimeter is, in any dimension, is a critical element, or whether solid or only solid and not semi-solid particles are included. So all this will be refined along the assessment of the risks and also socio-economic impacts. Pete, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think I would only say that it's important for us to understand the impacts of a broader restriction in order that a more narrow restriction could be sensibly and proposed or justified based on the socioeconomic impacts, for example, because we don't want to have unintended consequences beyond the risks of microplastic particles once they're maybe more refined. But unless we understand what the broader impacts could be of a broad definition, it's difficult to justify a more narrow one.
Okay, and I think, just to reiterate perhaps something I said right at the beginning of the presentation, we only have 12 months to gather the information, make our investigation and analysis, and decide whether or not a restriction is to be proposed. So we don't have so much time to have more than one major information gathering session. So I think we would definitely encourage you to send in all the information you think could be used by us to make our investigation, both as my colleagues have said, on the definition and on the uses. We can of course always come back later to ask specific questions or to have more specific information gathering, but at least for the general kick-off information gathering, to gather as much information as we can, we only have this period that's in the call for evidence, and we would very much encourage you to send in the information that you have at this stage, so we have it and we can investigate and analyse it. Next question, Pete. Most plastics are in a raw form before processing into final products is undertaken under the current definition, less than 5 millimeters in one dimension when plastics are in pellet form. How would these type of plastics sit in the scope of the investigation?
Yeah. Yes, we appreciate this. We understand that the definition that's been proposed would include some of these pellet forms. I think I already answered this question, I think, a little bit earlier on when I was talking about whether or not those pellets are consumed during the manufacture of an article, for example, and then those pellets wouldn't be present in the final product or would be intentionally released from that final product once it was placed on the market and in use, for example. So they're within the scope of our investigation, that's for sure, but I think it's probably unlikely that they would be within the scope of our potential restriction unless those microplastics were being intentionally released.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, I think, one you've already covered a little bit, but to give an example of a product where microplastics are intentionally released during the lifetime but not intentionally added to the product. Is there anything extra you can say?
I mean, I think all we know, we can refer people back to the study that was prepared for the Commission by AMIC, when they talk about various uses in agriculture, as seed coatings, as nutrient prills, for example, where microplastics could be produced intentionally as a consequence of the function of that product.
I have a question here on describing the uses. Evgeny, maybe I can ask you this one. How can a use be submitted to us, I think, if the definition is not clear? If the size is less than 5 millimeter, a tremendous number of materials fall under it. Can the definition clearly be sharpened to real microplastics with a molecular weight and a small particle size, a minimum particle size, I guess?
Well, if the issue is truly the 5 millimeter, perhaps we should mention that this cutoff point is also used in national legislation. In almost the slide, Mark, that you showed on national legislation, not only in Europe but also internationally, that was the cutoff point. And there were some studies done by RIVM, I think, that looked into why this 5 millimeter was used, and there are a number of international organizations that have looked also at the 5 millimeter. We do want to get that feedback, I guess, that a very large amount of uses would be covered. And so please do provide the information during the call for evidence. It will be useful if you, at a minimum, identify the use, identify the function of microplastics. Sorry, I'll backtrack a little bit. So do look at our broad definition, identify the uses that you have that would fall into that definition, describe the function of microplastics in that use, and then, if possible, provide information on the tonnages of microplastics and the potential impacts of a restriction on your business or industry as a whole.
Okay,
Yes, we
thanks for
would
that.
appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Pete, another one for you. Does the microplastic definition only cover particles in products that are solid? Will water-soluble polymers also be covered? Will a gel formation of polymers in a product be covered by the call for evidence?
Okay. Yes, thanks. So the working definition is broad and it's quite ambiguous. I think we recognise this, but there's two elements that we've tried, at least in the background document, to clarify with some proposed definitions. The first of that is solid. So the working definition definitely includes solid particles. And the second is semi-solid, and this is a particle which is semi-solid, and there's some technical details of that in the background document. We know that we are likely to have to develop this issue of solubility within the definition as we move forwards. But I think the hazard and the risk posed by microplastics are predominantly associated with them as solid particle entities. And on that basis, I think that soluble polymers are unlikely to really be the focus of our investigation here. We are focusing on the solid and the semi-solid particles. I mean, if there's an insoluble polymer, a soluble polymer that in a product forms a semi-solid particle, then of course that's consistent with our working definition. And we would invite people to tell us about those sorts of uses.
Okay, thank you, Pete. The next question, could a specific test protocol be imposed to show the safety of microplastics in the aquatic compartment and the potential for biodegradability? I think at the moment, if there are such test protocols available, which can be used to look at the risk or help to look at the hazard and risk of microplastics, we'd be very interested in that information. And of course, a restriction can be any condition imposed on, as I said earlier, on the manufacture, import, or use of a microplastic. So this could be a potential element that we could consider in a restriction. And also we are very interested in this element of biodegradability. We mentioned it a number of times in the information that we would like to gather on various polymers and microparticles. So if you have information on this, please submit it. We'd be very interested in it. It's difficult to say right now whether this would be the final outcome of our work, but I think it's definitely an element that we would consider.
Yeah, I think I'd just emphasise that the major concern, or at least one of the key concerns with these microplastic particles, is their persistence in the environment. I think particularly within the marine environment, where these plastics can persist for long periods of time, and then make them available for being accumulated by organisms within that environment, and then potentially being passed through the food chain where they're eventually consumed by humans in their food. So we are very interested in this persistence issue in terms of microplastic particles, but I would emphasise that under REACH we are not necessarily just looking at the marine compartment, and so of course persistence would need to be addressed across different environmental compartments where these microplastic particles could eventually find themselves. So the freshwater compartment is relevant, the marine water aquatic compartment is relevant, but of course the terrestrial compartment, agricultural soils, would also be relevant. So we'd be looking at persistence, potential for biodegradation or degradation across all of these compartments. When we were looking about the impact of persistence on this overall hazard and risk of a microplastic particle.
Okay, thanks, Pete. And another question, I think, for you. Would the use in liquid chromatography fall within the research and development definition?
I think research and development has a number of caveats associated in terms of whether or not they're under controlled conditions, for example, and a tonnage as well. So I think potentially it could, but you would need to look at those other elements as well to be whether or not you're outside of that definition. I think given the potential hazard of a microplastic, if they were, for example, disposed of down the drain, for example, that might not necessarily be considered as controlled conditions. But I mean, I think have a look at the guidance on scientific research and development.
Yes, and as I said, we will make a link to that in the Q&A. There's a question here on alternatives. Evgenia, maybe I can ask you this one. Are we going to take into account additives composition in order to help industry to choose better environmentally friendly additives, alternatives? I'm not sure if this is an oxo-degradable question or a microplastics question, but maybe you can...
I think it could be for microplastics, but it may be more in your area, because you would be looking also at the hazards from the chemical composition of microplastics, right?
Yeah.
Whether they present risk.
I think that's interesting. The additives have been proposed as one of the vectors, if I can say that, by which a microplastic particle can cause risk in the environment. So the microplastics are accumulated within an organism, and then the additives can be released from those, potentially causing some harm. So of course the additives included in that microplastic are a component of their hazard and risk. Some of the other vectors, if I can refer to them as such, is in as much as the microplastic particle could accumulate persistent pollutants in the environment, and then of course release those within an organism once they've been absorbed. So these will be elements of the risk that we will take into account. And as Mark said, a restriction can be any condition. So it's potentially conceivable that there could be a restriction on the types of additives that could be included within a microplastic particle, for example, as a consequence of this type of restriction.
Thanks. I have a simple sounding question, but I'm not sure that it's the answer is so easy. Is there a definition or a reference to a definition for plastic? Is rubber included as a plastic? Maybe I can ask you that, Pete.
Yeah, I think, well, this is coming back again to the starting points that we've had, which are the various national legislations on microplastic particles. From those, we can see that there isn't a standard definition of plastic, because these types of legislation have approached this issue differently. I think we are very interested in stakeholders' views about how best to define plastic and how best to define microplastic, and we will try and take those into account as we develop the definition as we go forwards.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How meaningful is a restriction on the EU level, considering that microplastics are more of a global problem? I think this is an issue that we're not really covering in our call for evidence, and it's one of the issues that we know is very relevant and important, but it's not one of the elements we will cover today. We will be looking at this in terms of later on what's the overall risk reduction of our measure, but it's not something that we're going to cover in our call for evidence today. So I'll move on to the next question. Considering the amount of information that we'll be receiving, will we be using consultants to analyse the information, and who? Maybe I can just ask you, Evgenia, how we plan to analyse the information that we'll be getting. Not necessarily using consultants, but...
Yes, well, we are also very optimistic that we'll receive a large amount of information, so we look forward to that. We have, of course, a team here in ECHA that will be reviewing the answers and incorporating them in our analysis, and then into the Annex 15 report that recommends or not a restriction. We may use consultants, not maybe necessarily to gather information, maybe not necessarily to process the information from the call for evidence, but to gather additional information, specific information, and to complement what was received during the call for evidence. But at this point, it will be difficult, not knowing what type of information we will receive. It will be difficult to say whether we and for what we will be using consultants.
Okay, thank you. Two questions now on the definition and specifically the 5mm size again. So concerning the definition, less than 5mm in one side would include plastic bags, foils, etc. And then another question, shouldn't it be less than 5mm in each size? So maybe you can answer those together, Pete.
Yeah, okay, on this first part about the high surface area films and bags, I think we're aware of that as a potential issue introduced by the working definition. So we'll of course be looking at that and see whether or not it makes sense in terms of these risks posed by intentionally added microplastics, and I think it's this intentionally added or intentionally released which will be important when it comes to thinking about this issue of high surface area articles that would be consistent with our definition of a microplastic. I think this comes from the marine litter issue, in as much as a plastic bag would be considered to be marine litter. It may not be completely appropriate for the way that we're addressing this within a REACH context. So we're aware of this, and if necessary, we will modify this working definition as we go forward. In terms of this, whether or not the 5mm should be expressed in 5mm in every dimension, yes, we know that there are studies that have used that as the definition. So the Commission's initial working definition on as this Eunomia project that we sometimes refer to, their definition of a microplastic is 5mm in every dimension. At least their initial working definition was that. So again, it just comes back to this point that we know that there are different definitions of microplastics out there. What we want to understand, so the relative advantages and disadvantages and pros and cons of each of those from you as our stakeholders, as we go forward and try and establish an unambiguous, appropriate definition that's linked clearly to the risks that the microplastics pose in the environment.
Okay, so next question. You're referring to plastic microparticles. We would expect that microparticle and plastic are discussed and defined during the process, and that's definitely the case. I can confirm that. And we would need to look at appropriate definitions for plastic and the other elements as part of our work. That's something that would definitely form part of our analysis.
No, I mean, I think it's clear that we will definitely be looking at these definitions and looking more closely at this link between polymer and what is considered to be plastic as well. Will be very important as we go forward, because not all polymers are plastics, but plastics are polymers, and we recognise this, and where you draw the distinction will be very much the focus of the work on our definition.
Another one here on the definition. If the risk effect of microplastics results from its chemical structure and chemical breakdown products, will those be listed specifically, or will all substances in microplastics be included a priori, with a lower risk substances exempted by derogation? Maybe Pete, you can start, and then again if you want to add anything.
Yeah, that was quite a long question, so
yeah.
I'm not sure I got all of it, but remind me if I miss a part out as I answer. But again, we need a definition that captures the essence of what poses the unacceptable risk, if that's what's concluded to be present on a union-wide basis. So I think at the moment we are fairly reticent about providing an explicit list of polymers or an explicit list of breakdown products, because that might then just be the focus of what we could consider to be a regrettable substitution, where a particle that has the same properties in the environment, and it could be the properties which are actually resulting in the risks from being placed on the market. So exactly how the definition is phrased will very much link to what are the properties in the environment that are associated with the risk. Is it the persistence, for example? Is it the size? Is it the potential for bioaccumulation, for example? And it may well be that the definition is linked to these properties rather than, for example, a specific substance or polymer or degradation product, for example.
Okay, and thank you for that. Next question, will we take into consideration the work already done by AMEC? Maybe I can ask you, Evgenia, to answer that one.
Yes, we will, and we have. It's the study is the link to the study is also included in the background document, and we're hoping that whoever is interested in answering during the call for evidence also looks at the findings of the AMEC report and complements the information provided on uses or addresses some issues that perhaps were not very well covered by this report, which was largely developed on the basis of information provided from industry. Also, if you are looking to provide information on alternatives for your uses and you think that there are no alternatives for your uses, we'd be interested to know whether you've looked at any of the alternatives that are included in the AMEC report and to give us an indication of why these alternatives are not suitable for your application. Perhaps whether the function is a little bit, perhaps maybe the function is a little bit different or imparts different qualities in the final product that your customers find not so desirable. So yes, please, when you're answering, take a look at that report and add to it or amend some of the information or use it as an inspiration for what kind of information we will be looking for.
Great, thank you. Next question, Pete, maybe you can answer this.
Yeah.
So far, we've not mentioned anything about the health impacts of microplastics. Can we confirm that the focus of this restriction will only be on environmental effects?
Okay, yes, a good question. I think we've very much been talking about release to the environment in the questions so far. Under REACH, of course, we can look at risks to the environment and to human health. So we can't rule out where the risks will arise from the microplastics here. We won't only be focusing on the environmental impacts, we'll certainly be looking at human health impacts from any uses of microplastic particles. I think clearly the focus would be on potential risks via the diet, and I think EFSA published a statement, and this is included within our background document, where they looked at potential risks from microplastics in food with a particular emphasis on seafood. So we're very interested in their ongoing work, and we will be looking at this element as part of our risk assessment.
Thank you for that. Then we have another question here on cost evaluation. Maybe I can ask this one to you, Evgenia. Cost evaluation of the microplastics in wastewater treatment plants might be very difficult to evaluate. Would you also be interested in qualitative information on the influence of microplastics on sewage sludge?
Yes, we will. There is some information, I believe, already in the AMEC report in terms of how much it will take to upgrade wastewater treatment plants to to be able to handle microplastics, remove microplastics from the water. But we will also be interested in information on any qualitative impacts of for the presence of microplastics in sludge, for example, and whether how is that then handled, whether it is used in agricultural fields, and what will be the impact if it isn't used in agricultural fields, for example, loss of nutrition. All that kind of information will also be useful for us. No?
Okay, thanks. That's a good answer. Thank you. Now, another question about the definition. if plastic materials below 5 millimeters are intended to be covered in the scope, what happens if such particles are bound together into a larger piece of plastic before it reaches the professional user or the consumer? And to give an example here of a textile, is this covered in our scope?
It's another good question, and I think all of these questions on definition were what we expected today. So I mean, keep asking the questions on the definition. We'll try and answer as many as we can in this Q&A document. I think this comes back to this issue of intentional use or intentional release. Textiles, as we know, can release microplastics or synthetic textiles as a result of wear and tear. And so, of course, they would be outside of the scope of our potential restriction. But if, for example, there was a textile that was designed and it was intentionally releasing microplastics in that intended function of that textile, then that would be something that we could investigate and potentially include within the scope. So it comes back to this intention of the microplastics.
Okay, thanks for that. And we have another definition question, so maybe I can come straight back to you about what is our definition of semi-solid microplastic. I know we've covered this in the background document, but maybe you want to say a few words.
I don't think I could complement what's in the background document usefully here. I think make sure that if you're logged on here, you have access to the background document so that you can look at how we define semi-solid in there. It's in a footnote. It links to something called the glass transition temperature of a polymer, and then have a look at that. And if that still doesn't make sense after you've looked at it, then of course feed that back to us in the call for evidence, or of course you can send us a follow-up question after the webinar, and we can try and answer that question for you.
Okay, thank you. I have a very practical question here about when the Q&A document might be published. I think, as we said in the presentation, we will publish it as soon as possible. We need to have some time to go through the list of questions and answers, and give some time perhaps for people to send in additional questions. But we will get this onto our website as soon as possible, and make an announcement in the e-news that it's there, so that you're aware of this. Then another question on hydrogels. Is this, Pete, maybe you can answer this again. What is the concern regarding hydrogels?
Well, I think the concern is something that we would need to go into detail with in terms of our analysis. I think the reason they're included is because they were mentioned by AMEC within their study as a potential material that could be a microplastic. We would need to analyse that and see whether or not hydrogels have the same sort of hazard profile as a microplastic. So for now, I can't give an answer in terms of what those hazards are, but we will look at those.
Okay. Next question. If we sell only substances being REACH registered and as polymers are not registered, does that mean we have no need to send in uses or any other information for your study, as there is no evidence? Evgenia, is this one you can take?
Well, perhaps we should refer you to our broad definition, and if you could maybe see whether what you manufacture falls within that definition, and you're aware that your plastic products, intermediate plastic products, are used down the supply chain in uses that may intentionally add microplastics, then you should it will be useful if we receive information from you on your supply chain, the tonnages that you produce, the uses that you would serve down the the supply chain. Yes, I think, and other information that is included in question 4 and 5 of a web form, to the extent possible, that will be very useful.
So I think it's also worth saying that although polymers are not covered or exempt, or they're exempted from registration, they're not exempted from restrictions. So we need this information on uses that you mentioned, to be able to fully understand how the market for these ones works, and so we can take it into account in the restrictions. So I think you are very much encouraged to send this information in so we can take it into account. Thanks, Evgenia. Another good question here on the definition. What's the meaning of professional use, Pete?
I might throw this one back to you, Mark, as well. Yeah, for the scope of our investigation, at least, we are interpreting this term professional use quite widely. So this could be any use that isn't a consumer use. So this would include uses on industrial sites too, in terms of the scope of our investigation here. I think people will know that professional use is not defined under REACH.
Yes, I think it's worth clarifying that we are having a very wide investigation at the moment of uses, and it's encouraged to send in information if you have intentionally added or intentionally released microplastics, that you send us information on that so we can make sure that we take that into account in the investigation. Then we have a question on hazards. So does the REACH restriction only address CLP and Article 57 hazards, substances of very high concern? Which hazard is associated with microplastics in this regard?
Okay, yeah, I can try. So a restriction under REACH is not necessarily constrained by Article 57 hazards, but I think clearly the types of hazards like persistence and bioaccumulation will be hazard properties that we'll be very interested in terms of microplastics, and even the very persistent and very bioaccumulative properties we would look at in terms of microplastic particles. But we have a broader scope if we need to in terms of the risks that can be addressed by a restriction. So it's not like authorization, for example, where we only look at SVHC properties. Under restriction, any property that poses what's considered to be an unacceptable risk on an EU-wide basis can be addressed with a restriction.
Yes, I think this is something we covered a little bit earlier in the presentation, where we talked about the types of risks that can be restricted. We have the more normal threshold or non-threshold type approaches, but there's also a third approach where these aren't appropriate for addressing the risk. We can take a more case-by-case approach, and this was done in previous restrictions, for example, where taste or odour was the issue that was under consideration, and restriction was made on those substances. So we're not restricted just to CLP or Article 57 hazards. We can consider the issues much more widely. So we have a question on physical properties. So the physical properties of the microplastic that determine both its use in a product and its potential effect in the environment. One might conclude that the object to be restricted is an article, not a substance in an article. Is this clear, and can a distinction be made? Pete, can you throw any light on this?
Well, only in as much as we're obviously very aware that this discussion is taking place. But from our perspective, we don't see necessarily as a barrier in terms of our work here about whether or not a restriction would be needed or not. microplastic is a substance or a microplastic is an article, it's still possible to restrict their use under REACH if there's an unacceptable risk and it's considered that it would be proportionate to do so. But we'll continue to follow this issue and take account of it if necessary in terms of the definitions and what have you, and any text that is developed as we go forward in terms of what a restriction could look like.
Thanks for that, Pete. Just to say, I say as well that we're not just looking at the physical properties in terms of what effects the microplastics might have in the environment. So I think we would look much wider than just the physical properties in terms of its hazard. There's a question here then on the fashion industry is now concerned about these microplastics, or do we think the fashion industry should be concerned about microplastics? Evgeny, is this a use question you can answer?
My understanding is that microfibers in textiles are not intentionally added per se, but those are fibers that are unintentionally released during the washing of the products. And from that perspective, this use is handled by the research project led by Eunomia for the European Commission. And I think in your presentation you showed the link to the project. I think it was www.eumicroplastics.com, where you can get a little bit more information on the research that is currently ongoing, and you can follow in the future any actions that the Commission will take in that respect.
Okay.
I find something just to add on that. I think you're right, absolutely right, Evgeny. But it's possible you could take a broader view of what the fashion industry is, and we know that microplastics are used in cosmetics as well and makeups. So that's also a sector of use that we're very interested in. It's we know that it's not just necessarily exfoliating or cleansing uses of microplastics, but they're also present in makeups. We also know that potentially some glitters, for example, would be consistent with the definition of a microplastic particle. So whether or not the fashion industry is aware of this, I'm not sure, but we know that the cosmetics industry are aware of our work, and we will certainly look at those uses.
Thanks, yeah.
Okay. I have two more questions on the list in front of me. I also see that we're almost out of time for the webinar. Maybe I can quickly ask these two questions, and then I think we need to wrap up for today. So the first question, is any further information on the definition likely to be shared during the call for evidence period? Pete, maybe you want to answer that one?
Well, within this Q&A document, I think we always felt that if there was something that we could share with stakeholders that was meaningful in terms of the definition after this session, we would try and do that. And I think we will continue to try and do that. I can't promise necessarily that we will refine the working definition as part of the Q&A document, but I think we will try and clarify some of those issues for stakeholders so that they can engage properly with the call for evidence.
Okay, thanks. And then I think the last question today, if by the planned restriction microplastics is being removed from the environment, how is the topic of secondary microplastics being addressed? And the question makes the statement these are, of course, major contributors for plastic in oceans. I don't know if both of you want to take this last question. Maybe Pete can go first.
Yes. I think I had mentioned before that our restriction was proposed as a result of the Commission's plastic strategy, and I know that there were a number of elements of that plastic strategy that was to deal with this other issue of secondary microplastics. So I would refer people back to the plastics strategy and this Eunomia study that Evgeny also mentioned. We'll be looking at these secondary microplastics. Is there anything that you wanted?
No, just refer them again to the website.
Just that one final question.
Yes,
there,
one just come in. Yes,
Yes,
AMEC report focuses on a few sectors preliminarily considered as sources. However, bigger sources such as agriculture and abrasives, there is a lack of detailed data. How will we manage cases where no information is provided? Yes, I think that's a good question to finish up on. Pete, do you want to go first, and then maybe any supplement?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we hope that given maybe the greater the emphasis of our work is perhaps higher than Amex was, stakeholders will be encouraged to participate within our call for evidence. So perhaps where they failed to get information, we may be more successful. And the other thing to mention is, of course, that quite often within restrictions, an absence of information wouldn't necessarily correspond with an absence of a restriction. We may then assume that if we don't receive information for a particular sector, then there would be no impact of a restriction. So I think the onus is very much on stakeholders to make clear where they have a use, and in order that we can take into account the impact of that use within our analysis.
Yes, just to mention that there are a number of associations who were approached as part of this Amex study but did not participate. We would encourage them to provide information this time around in the call for evidence. And as Pete said, the absence of information doesn't mean absence of a restriction. With that said, though, we will still, as I mentioned earlier, we will still try to complement the information from AMIC with the information from the call for evidence and any potential additional supplementary research that we will undertake to ensure that that we capture all the sectors and we refine the scope of the restriction to the extent that it addresses the risks and it is proportionate to the risk.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of the question and answer session. I'd just like to thank all the participants who sent in questions. Very interesting, and I hope we've managed to answer them to a greater extent. We will, as we promised earlier, collate all of these questions and our answers into a document that we will share on our website, and we will do that as soon as we can. If we haven't got round to answering your question today, or if another question comes to you that you would like us to consider, please send those in to the address we had earlier on the screen, to our information desk. If you have press inquiries, please make those to the press mailbox. And I'd just like to also thank very much my panel members for their efforts in answering the questions today. And with that, I'd like to close the session and wish you a very good day, and we very much look forward to the information that you will be submitting in the call for evidence. Thank you.